think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
On the last episode, I talked a bit about the astral planes, and in this one, I'll dive into that a little bit more. Many people assume that a spiritual state of being means existing outside of a body, and that the soul is a formless bit of ephemeral awareness, or merely the dissolving remains of a permanently dying shade of someone's electromagnetic neural resonance. From what my spirits have told me, and from what I've experienced with them, this is really not true. Spirits definitely have form, and they are not just floating minds or balls of light. For those spirits who have passed on from a physical form, this body is nearly identical to their physical body, only, as I mentioned in the last episode, either better or worse, depending on whether they find themselves in the higher or the lower levels or realms. Also, this astral form is more malleable and durable than the physical body, especially in the higher realms. Clothes can be changed instantly, space can be traversed immediately, and matter can merge and then separate without any damage or change. For instance, spirit people can actually fuse with each other. Actually, I noticed a great parallel in the recent movie Blade Runner 2049. Ryan Gosling's character's hologram girlfriend in the movie really strongly reminded me of my experiences with spirits. Since spiritual form is more malleable and durable, body modification has reached shocking and extreme levels of intensity on the other side. In fact, when I introduced some of my spirits to the concept of the Cenobites in the Hellraiser movies, they were a bit aghast, insisting that beings just like them are very real in the spirit world. They are people who were once physical, but have died and moved on. Mostly always people who were into tattoos, piercings, and more extreme forms of body modification in their physical life. Just like Clive Barker's creations in The Hellbound Heart, they are a singular group, or even a sort of club, of people who have dedicated themselves to embracing pain and severe alterations to their body, oftentimes so extreme that they look like inhuman monstrosities or mangled corpses. And, just like Barker's creations, they aren't out to harm innocent people or entrap unwilling subjects, though you'd better know what you're getting into with them. They mean business and are not particularly pleasant. My spirits insist that Clive Barker must have been subconsciously or consciously influenced by spiritual forces when he created them. And now the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
I'm going to read some unusual events recorded in Victoria, Australia. In 1920, in the Bass Strait, 2 planes searching for a missing schooner saw lights. 1 plane flew into a large cloud and was never seen again, nor was the schooner. In February 1944, RAAF Beaufort bomber crew flying at 4,500 feet saw dark shadow flying alongside only 100 to 150 feet away, with flame belching from its end. During 18 to 20 minutes, the plane's radio and direction-finding instruments would not work until the UFO accelerated away. On October 21, 1978, Frederick Valentich disappeared on a flight to King Island. From August to September 1949, in the La Rissière Reservoir, Kineton, or Kinton, an animal with long shaggy ears which used to propel itself at tremendous speed seen in water several times by people living nearby. 13th July 1902 at Ramhead, sea monster seen by steamer crew, 30 to 35 feet long, with 4 fins 5 feet high, head bigger than a seal's. The 30th of September 1980, near Rosedale, farmhand woken at night by cattle bellowing, went out and saw a domed UFO moving just above paddock. It had no wings or tail, and he saw orange and blue lights on the 15-foot-tall craft. It hovered over water tank before landing in paddock. Farmhand went over to it on motorcycle, and as he approached, he heard a whistling noise and felt like jelly. As he watched from 40 feet, UFO made a screaming noise and took off, sending out a blast of hot air. Next day, he found the landing site clearly marked, and 10,000 gallons of water had gone from the tank. On the 11th of April 1965, in Wonthaggi, 2 unidentified submarines seen offshore. Navy could not identify them. On the 5th of April 1966, in Wycheproof, car headlight beams seemed to bend to right, and driver saw a conical light beam in field, object producing it flew away. Now in Western Australia, in 1930, in Mandurah, tiny, glistening, hairless, human-shaped creature entered house. In 1925, near Moora, Two young men saw object like two saucers face to face sitting on legs in paddock. It had oval windows and shimmered. When they returned several days later, it was not there. On the 20th of January, 1988, at Nullarbor Plain, a woman driving on Lonely Road with three sons said that the car was chased by an egg cup-shaped UFO, lifted from the ground and covered in ash. Now moving to Austria, in Eisenberg, Aloisa Lex saw visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who gave her messages, beginning 1946 when she was in a coma. In 1947, her father saw a beautiful woman dressed in white in the garden. Messages continued into the 1980s. In Gussing, poltergeist outbreak, September to December 1925, and intermittently for 3 years. In Lading, another poltergeist outbreak, 1916-18. Now, from the 24th of November, 1921 to the 31st of January, 1922, in, let's see if I can pronounce this, Lisebrook, Konten, poltergeist activity at inn and house where young maidservant employed. In the summer of 1921, near Rauris, Tatzelworm, a giant lizard, was seen. From July to August 1906 in Vienna, poltergeist outbreak in Smithy with movements of tools, coal, and iron. Now moving on to the Bahamas. On the 6th of March 1934 in Nassau, officers and passengers on board the Mauritania saw a 60-foot sea monster with undulating lumps and large head lying flat on water. On a spring evening in 1966 in Ireland, Margaret Johnson and John Farrell had been driving past the estate of Lord Dillon near Drogheda in County Louth, when they were forced to brake sharply. In the road just up ahead of them stood an extremely large animal with a horse-like body. Looking out of the window, Johnson at first thought that the creature was indeed a horse, until it turned to look at her. Then she screamed in absolute horror, for she could see only too clearly that it had the face of a man. And it was not an ordinary human face. Instead, its eyes bulged grotesquely, its skin was hairy, and its mouth was grimacing in a hideous, evil leer. Petrified with fear, the two eyewitnesses were unable at first to flee from this horrific monstrosity, because for almost 2 minutes, its enormous bulk continued to block their path, standing directly in front of their car upon its 4 sturdy equine limbs. Then suddenly, just as abruptly as it had arrived, it vanished. The two shaken travelers drove rapidly away and onto Johnson's home, where they were so desperate to reach the safety of the house that they drove straight through the gate without even stopping to open it, sending it crashing off its hinges. For several days afterwards, Johnson remained extremely shaken and sick. Interesting to note that one of the most feared monsters of Irish mythology is the puka, which often assumes the guise of a malevolent horse or pony. There's a similar event in England in February 1996. A caller on a British ITV television show called This Morning, the caller's name was Nicky Knott, claimed that while driving home along a back road in King's Lynn, near the Norfolk-Lincolnshire border, one evening a couple of years earlier, her husband saw what he initially thought was a horse or deer standing at the right-hand side of the road. As he approached, however, he could plainly see that although it did have a horse's body and legs, its face was that of a man. Terrified, Knott drove on as fast as he could, leaving the monster far behind and not looking back once until he had reached home. Equally macabre was a harpy-like horror known as the scree, which in 1746 was reputedly spied by no less eminent an eyewitness than Lord General Murray. This occurred when, just before the famous but disastrous Battle of Culloden between the Duke of Cumberland's troops and the Jacobite rebels began in the Scottish Highlands, a monstrous winged beast with a human head and burning red eyes hovered on black leathery wings over a detachment of terrified soldiers, emitting spine-chilling shrieks like the very incarnation of death itself. An interesting note I'll make here is that sounds very much in description, very similar to the Mothman, famously mostly reported from the Point Pleasant area. The scree has supposedly been spied on at least 2 further occasions. On May 22, 1915, during World War I, it reputedly appeared in the sky above a 500-strong group of Royal Scotsmen and officers about to catch a train at Lambert Railway that would begin their journey to the Flanders Fields. Alarmed by such an ill omen, the men had to be forced at gunpoint by their officers to mount the train. That train crashed later that same day and caught fire, killing 227 passengers and injuring 246 more. That's interesting since a lot of the reported sightings of the Mothman in Point Pleasant preceded the disastrous collapse of the bridge, which claimed many lives. In summer 1993, the scree was allegedly spied at a mist-shrouded rock outcrop by 2 lost hillwalkers in Glencoe. In California, in November 1896, hundreds of residents of the San Francisco area saw a large, elongated, dark object, which carried brilliant searchlights and was capable of flying against the wind. Between January and March 1897, it vanished entirely. And suddenly a staggering number of observations of an identical object were made in the Midwest. We have seen how Alexander Hamilton described it, a craft with turbine wheels and a glass section with strange beings aboard looking down, a description not unlike that given by Barney Hill. In March, an object of even stranger appearance was seen by Robert Hibbard, a farmer living 15 miles north of Sioux City, Iowa. Hibbard not only saw the airship, but an anchor hanging from a rope attached to the mysterious craft caught his clothes and dragged him several dozen feet until he fell back to earth. An experience related by Captain James Hooten, described in the Arkansas Gazette as the well-known Iron Mountain Railroad conductor, is as follows. I had gone down to Texarkana to bring back a special, and knowing that I would have some 8 to 10 hours to spend in Texarkana, I went to Homan, Arkansas, to do a little hunting. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I reached that place. The sport was good, and before I knew it, it was after 6 o'clock when I started to make my way back toward the railroad station. As I was tramping through the bush, my attention was attracted by a familiar sound. A sound for all the world like the working of an air pump on a locomotive. I went at once in the direction of the sound, and there in an open space of some 5 or 6 acres, I saw the object making the noise. To say that I was astonished would but feebly express my feelings. I decided at once that this was the famous airship seen by so many people about the country. There was a medium-sized looking man aboard, and I noticed that he was wearing smoked glasses. He was tinkering around what seemed to be the back end of the ship, and as I approached I was too dumbfounded to speak. He looked at me in surprise and said, "Good day, sir, good day." I asked, "Is this the airship?" And he replied, "Yes, sir." Whereupon 3 or 4 other men came out of what was apparently the keel of the ship. A close examination showed that the keel was divided into 2 parts, terminating in front like the sharp edge of a knife-like edge, while the side of the ship bulged gradually toward the middle and then receded. There were 3 large wheels upon each side made of some bending metal and arranged so that they became concave as they moved forward. "I beg your pardon, sir," I said. "The noise sounds a great deal like a Westinghouse air brake." "Perhaps it does, my friend," he answered. "We are using condensed air in aeroplanes, but you will know more about later on." "All ready, sir," someone called out when the party all disappeared below. I observed that just in front of each wheel, a 2-inch tube began to spurt air on the wheels, and they commenced revolving. The ship gradually arose with a hissing sound. The aeroplanes suddenly sprang forward, turning their sharp ends skyward. Then the rudders at the end of the ship began to veer to one side, and the wheels revolved so fast that one could scarcely see the blades. In less time than it takes to tell you, the ship had gone out of sight. Captain Hooten adds that he could discover no bell or bell rope about the ship and was greatly shocked by this detail, since he thought every well-regulated air locomotive should have one. He left a detailed drawing of the machine. On November 2nd, 1967, in Riri, Idaho, Guy Tossi and Will Begay saw a sudden blinding flash in front of their car which surprised the 2 Navajo Indian youths on a highway just outside of Riri at 9:30 at night. The flash was followed by the abrupt appearance of an 8-foot-wide domed saucer with flashing green and orange lights around its rim. The car stopped as the object hovered about 5 feet above the road, bathing the area in a green light. Through the transparent dome, the witnesses could see 2 small occupants. When the dome opened, one figure floated down to the ground. It stood about 3.5 feet tall and had a kind of backpack that protruded behind its hairless head. Its oval face was heavily pitted and creased, its ears were large and high, its eyes were small and round, and its mouth was slit-like. No nose was visible on the deeply scarred face. The entity approached the car and opened the driver's side door. When it slid behind the wheel, the 2 youths moved over to the right. Then, with the object in a fixed position a few feet in front, the car was driven or towed well out into a wheat field. When the car stopped, Tossi opened the door and ran to a farmhouse a quarter-mile away. A bright light, apparently from the second occupant, followed him. Begay, meanwhile, cowered in the front seat as the entity spoke to him in unintelligible bird-like sounds. When the second entity returned to the car, the first emerged, and the 2 then floated up into the object, which rose out of sight in zigzag fashion. Tossi was so frightened that he had difficulty telling the farmer and his family the story. When they finally accompanied him back to the field, they found Begay in shock, sitting speechless in the car with his eyes closed. The car lights were on and the engine was running. The youths reported the incident to the deputy sheriff, and the state police investigated. Others had apparently seen lights in the area, and some farmers reported that their cattle had bolted during the evening for unknown reasons. On February 24th, 1977, in, well, the attempt to pronounce this, Langenargen, Baden-Württemberg, Germany, Lothar Schäffler, a 25-year-old railway worker, was dropping a friend off at home at 2 in the morning after leaving a bar together, when they were blinded by the bluish-white light of 2 approaching objects in the sky. The lights then stood still for 5 minutes, moved again toward one another, seemed almost to touch, and finally just turned off and disappeared. When Schäffler's friend, an innkeeper, entered the house, he locked the door behind him. On his way up the stairs, he saw that the unknown lights had reappeared, but as he approached a window, he felt paralyzed. Meanwhile, Schaeffler fled, terrorized by the object's enormous size, and ran around the house looking for an open door. Seeking shelter, he then ran to the back door of a neighboring house. There he heard a short whistling sound, felt a draft of air, and suddenly saw two strange beings appear behind him. They stood about 4 feet tall. Their bodies appeared human, though their hands reached their knees, and their forefingers were webbed. Their skin was brighter than a human's. The only clothing he noticed was a frill, like a harlequin's, around their necks, with 6 or 7 light green star-like serrations. Their heads were bare and perfectly round, as were their well-defined mouths. Schaeffler did not notice or see a neck, ears, or nose on the entities. Their eyes, which were slanted like an Asian's but not as narrow, stared at him unflinchingly. As the beings approached, their torsos rocked back and forth. After standing paralyzed for a while, Schaeffler was able to move again, and he immediately panicked. He threw himself against the neighbor's locked door, smashed the middle pane, unlocked the door from the inside, and covered his face as he fell on the floor. When the tenants heard this, they called the police and found Schaeffler lying there, his hand bleeding. The lights and the beings had disappeared. It was about 3:30 a.m., about an hour later than Schaeffler thought it was. The police took Schaeffler to the hospital, where his blood alcohol was tested and found to be quite low. They concluded that the episode could not be explained as due to alcohol delirium. Schaeffler suffered from insomnia in the weeks following the encounter, vomited several times at work, and developed a stomach ulcer. Several other bar patrons reported seeing the object that night, and 7 years later, the Italian Defense Ministry reported that an Italian fighter plane had been followed by a UFO for 23 minutes that night as well. In the fall of 1965, Mexican newspapers carried accounts of 3 unnamed women in a southern suburb of Mexico City who claimed they encountered a group of beings at least 10 feet tall with glowing red eyes. The witnesses said the creatures were wearing shiny gray garments and boots, but had no discernible noses or mouths. They did not linger to study the beings, but ran to the police. In Argentina, on October 18, 1963, Eugenio Douglas allegedly tried to fight off 3 shiny metal robots some 15 to 20 feet tall with a revolver. He told police that he drove his truck into a ditch after a brilliant white light engulfed it near the town of Montemex. The light, he said, came from a 25-foot disc parked in the middle of the highway. He leaped from his cab and, as the 3 indescribable beings got out of the saucer and approached him, flourished the revolver he carried to ward off hijackers. He fired 4 shots at them and ran wildly toward the town. The saucer made several passes at him, he said, and each time he felt a wave of terrible, suffocating heat. The police examiner later found that Douglas had suffered severe, unusual burns, unlike anything he had ever seen before. In Wachendorf, West Germany, in 1948, a refugee family from Bohemia was lodging in one room of an old mansion and was there suffering from poltergeist activity. On this occasion, the 2 beds in the room were bombarded by stones, tools, and other objects. The mother put the tools away in their box, closed it, and sat on it. To her amazement, as she sat there, she saw the tools reappear one by one in different parts of the room. On another occasion, her husband said he was hit on the head by a wooden shoe which came out of a closed glass cupboard. In November 1968 to February 1969 in West Germany, objects went missing indoors, would later be seen falling outside, and one of the investigators decided to test this. He placed perfume bottles and pill bottles on the kitchen table, sent everyone outside, closed all doors and windows, and then joined the others. Soon a perfume bottle was seen, and then a pill bottle. They were first seen at roof level as they moved earthwards in a zigzag motion. Side note, the zigzag motion often seen, with objects in poltergeist cases reminds me of the strange falling leaf zigzag movement of a lot of UFO sightings. In Finland in 1917, or 1918, witnesses were startled by seeing 2 buttons fall, first in a coin clicking on the parquet floor. Then more coins fell at 5, 10, or 15-minute intervals, and the 2 frightened students fetched more witnesses. As they watched, the coins kept pouring down. They placed them on the mantelpiece and left to spend the night elsewhere. The next day, the coins were still where they had placed them. The coins were found to be genuine, and no one claimed them, so the lucky recipients went out to celebrate with friends at a restaurant.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out of you.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, in addition to the spirits of people who have died, there are countless other types of spirit beings in the astral planes and beyond that can have many different forms. They could be anything from a dog with an alligator's head, to an anthropomorphic cartoon cat, to a spirit being who is utterly indistinguishable from a human spirit. Another interesting thing about astral places, and even astral states of being, is that they can be very informed by, or even completely created by, cultures and belief systems. For instance, ancient Egyptians may very well have experienced after death something very much like their religious belief in an afterlife trial and judgment. Also, an indigenous tribe who believe that, say, when they die, they will go to the fields of their ancestors to reunite with dead loved ones may not be entirely wrong. That place most likely exists as an astral location. There are many astral places of the past which are still around. People can tend to have a fondness or even an obsession with a certain culture or time period and not want to change their environment. Much of these astral realms of the past are in the lower astral planes. The Victorian age is particularly popular in the spirit world for some reason, something which I've witnessed myself. Something very fascinating is that my spirits told me that many fictional properties from the physical world continue to be created on the other side. In other words, there are astral Sherlock Holmes stories, astral Batman comics, astral Star Wars movies, astral Star Trek shows, all of which don't exist in our physical world. So if you're a big fan of a fictional property, don't worry about death ending your experience with them. You may even be involved in creating them or becoming a part of them in some way, as fictional work can be experienced in an entirely different, immersive, and inclusive way in the astral worlds. On that note, years ago, when one of my spirits told me that there is an astral equivalent to movies, I asked her to spell out for me the name of a movie which was currently popular in our world. Her answer surprised me at the time. She said it was called God is Love. It makes more sense to me now, since I learned that she is a spirit of the higher realms whose primary work is to help people in the lower realms evolve out of those less pleasant places. Over the years, I learned interesting things about her by asking questions. This was before I developed the ability to see them in a way. Her name, which I won't mention here out of respect for her, is very beautiful and exotic, and I've never heard it before in the physical world. She never lived as a physical person in our world, even though she is a beautiful young blonde woman. She said that she didn't always have this form, that throughout different incarnations, different lives and deaths, she had various different states of being. She said that a very, very long time ago, her first life was being basically a weaponized monster. She was initially created in the lower realms as a living spirit being designed with the purpose to attack another spirit. Over many lifetimes in different forms, she evolved spiritually further and further up, so to speak, until she left the lower realms. Getting back to her current life, another interesting thing about her is that her clothes were always a combination of black and white. Also, when she was in a good mood, her hair was blonde, but her hair would be black when she was in a bad mood or was on her period. Yes, some spirits have periods. It's not about reproduction, it's about being a woman. I remember the first thing which made me begin to see that she had my well-being in mind. I had put a roast in the oven to slow cook it overnight. When I went to bed, she pulled on my arm and led me to the kitchen and pushed my arm down to the oven, obviously wanting to draw my attention to it. It turned out that she thought that I had left the oven on accidentally and wanted to let me know. I thanked her and explained that I intended to leave the oven on overnight and that it was safe. Another occupation of hers, in addition to helping people out of the lower realms, is basically the astral world's version of interior design. In fact, I met another spirit through her because they both worked in spirit interior design. Even though they're of different levels of the astral planes, they can work together since beings from higher levels can go down to lower levels at will. The spirit woman also became very close to me. She isn't as old as, or on the same higher astral level as the other, and she was initially created as what you could basically call a spirit harem girl. Her original name was also very unusual, though extremely different from the other spirit's name. It sounded like a Native American language. She decided to change her name over time to something more current and Western. Now, those two are great, and still allies of mine to this day, over a decade later, but there were spirits I was close to which I eventually had to get rid of or sever ties with, because over time they turned out to be troublemakers. One even stormed out on me furious. It turned out that she was a Christian and was upset by something I said which offended her. I can't remember now exactly what it was. Well, in closing, in regard to the astral planes, my spirits tell me that there are many other places and states of existence beyond the astral even.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
Okay, I'm going to read some quotes from people of note regarding UFOs. Theodore C. Loader III, Ph.D., Professor Emeritus of Earth Sciences, University of New Hampshire, said in his paper entitled ET Contact, The Implications for Post-Contact Advancement in Science and Technology, dated May 27, 2011, quote, "Intelligent beings from other star systems have been and are visiting our planet Earth. They are variously referred to as visitors, others, star people, ETs, etc. They are visiting Earth now. This is not a matter of conjecture or wistful thinking, end quote. John Podesta, Chief of Staff for Bill Clinton, counselor to Barack Obama, and head of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign before she dropped out, stated that, quote, "The time to pull the curtain back on this subject is long overdue. We have statements from the most credible sources, those in a position to know, about a fascinating phenomenon, the nature of which is yet to be determined," end quote. This was taken from Leslie Kean's 2010 New York Times bestseller, UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on Record, where Podesta wrote the foreword. Dr. Edgar Mitchell, SCD, sixth man to walk on the moon, said, quote, "Yes, there have been crashed craft and bodies recovered. We are not alone in the universe. They have been coming here for a long time," end quote. In an interview with Nova, John Mack, a Harvard professor, psychiatrist, and Pulitzer Prize recipient, stresses that, quote, "Yes, it's both. It's both literally physically happening to a degree, and it's also some kind of psychological spiritual experience occurring and originating perhaps in another dimension. And so the phenomenon stretches us, or it asks us to stretch to open to realities that are not simply the literal physical world, but to extend to the possibility that there are other unseen realities from which our learning processes over the past several hundred years have closed us off," end quote. According to retired McGill University professor in the Department of Psychology, Dr. Don Donderi, quote, "Some of what people report as UFOs are extraterrestrial vehicles. Some of those extraterrestrial vehicles actually have ET crews, and some of those ET crews catch and release humans," end quote. Taken from his book, UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, Richard Dolan says, quote, "There are a great many photographs of such body marks, many of which are in an equilateral triangle pattern of red dots on the wrist or near the ankle. Also common are scoop marks, in which it appears as if a small amount of tissue was removed from beneath the skin, leaving an indentation," end quote. Former NASA astronaut and Princeton physics professor Brian O'Leary said in a talk which you can find on YouTube, quote, "There is abundant evidence that we are being contacted, that civilizations have been visiting us for a very long time," end quote. Paul Hellyer, former Canadian defense minister, said in a speech he gave, which you can find on YouTube, quote, "Decades ago, visitors from other planets warned us about where we were headed and offered to help. But instead, we, or at least some of us, interpreted their visits as a threat and decided to shoot first and ask questions after. The inevitable result was that some of our planes were lost, but how many were due to retaliation and how many were a result of our own stupidity is a moot point. In one of the cases during the Cold War, 1961, there were about 50 UFOs in formation flying south from Russia across Europe. The Supreme Allied Commander was very concerned and was about ready to press the panic button when they turned around and went back over the North Pole. They decided to do an investigation, and they investigated for 3 years, and they decided that with absolute certainty that 4 different species, at least, had been visiting this planet for thousands of years. There's been a lot more activity in the past 2 decades, especially since we invented the atomic bomb. They are very concerned about that, and if we will use it again, because the whole cosmos is in unity, and it affects not just us, but other people in the cosmos. They are very much afraid that we might start using atomic weapons again, and this would be very bad for us and them also," end quote. Former head of the CIA, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, said in an article in the New York Times dated February 28, 1960, quote, "Behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about UFOs, but through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe that unknown flying objects are nonsense," end quote. Lord Admiral Hill Norton, former Chief of Defense Staff, 5-star Admiral of the Royal Navy, Chairman of the NATO Military Committee, said, quote, "There are objects in our atmosphere which are technically miles in advance of anything we can deploy, that we have no means of stopping them coming here, and that there is a serious possibility that we are being visited and have been visited for many years by people from outer space, from other civilizations. That it behooves us, in case some of these people in the future or now should turn hostile, to find out who they are, where they come from, and what they want. This should be the subject of rigorous scientific investigation and not the subject of rubbishing by tabloid newspapers," end quote. From UFOs and the National Security State Volume 2, written by Richard Dolan, General Carlos Castro Cavero, from 1979, said, quote, "Everything is in a process of investigation both in the United States and in Spain, as well as the rest of the world. The nations of the world are currently working together in the investigation of the UFO phenomenon. There is an international exchange of data," end quote. Jack Kasher, Ph.D., Professor Emeritus of Physics, University of Nebraska, said, quote, "There is another way, whether it's wormholes or warping space. There's got to be a way to generate energy so that you can pull it out of the vacuum, and the fact that they're here shows us that they found a way," end quote. Former Alaskan Senator and 2008 presidential candidate Mike Gravel said in an interview on the show Viewpoint, which can be seen on YouTube, quote, "An extraterrestrial influence is investigating our planet. Something is monitoring the planet, and they are monitoring it very cautiously," end quote. Robert Gallay said, quote, "I must say that if your listeners could see for themselves the massive reports coming in from airborne gendarmerie and from the gendarmerie charged with the job of conducting investigations, all of which reports are being forwarded by us to the CNES, translated as National Center for Space Studies, then they would see that it is all pretty disturbing," end quote. All right, now I'm going to read from a rather bizarre FBI document. This particular FBI document was addressed to, quote, "certain scientists of distinction, to aeronautical and military authorities, and to a number of public officials." The document is a letter that was sent to the director of FBI in Washington from the San Francisco office on a matter pertaining to UFOs and extraterrestrials. Quote, "Lieutenant Colonel named Redacted of G2, G2 means Army Intelligence, San Francisco advised today he has no further information, and that our Seattle office is in possession of all information known by him and is handling the matter at Tacoma, Washington," end quote. The document goes on to provide a copy of a letter written by someone with several university degrees and a former university department head. The memorandum also states that the mere fact that the data herein were obtained by so-called supernormal means is probably sufficient to ensure its disregard by nearly all persons addressed. The letter goes on to outline and state that part of the discs carry crews, others are under remote control. Their mission is peaceful. The visitors contemplate settling on this planet. These visitors are human-like but much larger in size. They are not excarnate Earth people, but come from their own world. The discs possess some type of radiant energy. They do not come from any planet, as we use the word, but from an etheric planet which interpenetrates with our own and is not perceptible to us. The bodies of the visitors and the craft also automatically materialize on entering the vibratory rate of our dense matter. They re-enter the etheric at will, and so simply disappear from our vision without trace. The region they come from is not the astral plane, but corresponds to the Lakas or Talas. Students of esoteric matters will understand these terms.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is titled, "Is Death an Illusion? Evidence Suggests Death Isn't the End." It was written by Robert Lanza on November 19th, 2011 on psychologytoday.com. After the death of his old friend, Albert Einstein said, quote, "Now Besso has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing. People like us know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion," end quote. New evidence continues to suggest that Einstein was right. Death is an illusion. Our classical way of thinking is based on the belief that the world has an objective, observer-independent existence. But a long list of experiments shows just the opposite. We think life is just the activity of carbon and mixture of molecules. We live a while and then rot into the ground. We believe in death because we've been taught we die. Also, of course, because we associate ourselves with our body and we know bodies die. End of story. But biocentrism, a new theory of everything, tells us death may not be the terminal event we think. Amazingly, if you add life and consciousness to the equation, you can explain some of the biggest puzzles of science. For instance, it becomes clear why space and time, and even the properties of matter itself, depend on the observer. It also becomes clear why the laws, forces, and constants of the universe appear to be exquisitely fine-tuned for the existence of life. Until we recognize the universe in our heads, attempts to understand reality will remain a road to nowhere. Consider the weather outside. You see a blue sky, but the cells in your brain could be changed so the sky looks green or red. In fact, with a little genetic engineering, we could probably make everything that is red vibrate, or make a noise, or even make you want to have sex, as it does with some birds. You think it's bright out, but your brain circuits could be changed so it looks very dark out. You think it feels hot and humid, but to a tropical frog it would feel cold and dry. This logic applies to virtually everything. Bottom line, what you see could not be present without your consciousness. In truth, you can't see anything through the bone that surrounds your brain. Your eyes are not portals to the world. Everything you see and experience right now, even your body, is a whirl of information occurring in your mind. According to biocentrism, space and time aren't the hard, cold objects we think. Wave your hand through the air. If you take everything away, what's left? Nothing. The same applies for time. Space and time are simply the tools for putting everything together. Consider the famous two-slit experiment. When scientists watch a particle pass through two slits in a barrier, the particle behaves like a bullet and goes through one slit or the other. But if you don't watch, it acts like a wave and can go through both slits at the same time. So how can a particle change its behavior depending on whether you watch it or not? The answer is simple. Reality is a process that involves your consciousness. Or consider Heisenberg's famous uncertainty principle. If there is really a world out there with particles just bouncing around, then we should be able to measure all their properties. But you can't. For instance, a particle's exact location and momentum can't be known at the same time. So why should it matter to a particle what you decide to measure? And how can pairs of entangled particles be instantaneously connected on opposite sides of the galaxy as if space and time don't exist? Again, the answer is simple. Because they're not just out there. Space and time are simply tools of our mind. Death doesn't exist in a timeless, spaceless world. Immortality doesn't mean a perpetual existence in time, but resides outside of time altogether. Our linear way of thinking about time is also inconsistent with another series of recent experiments. In 2002, scientists showed that particles of light photons knew, in advance, what their distant twins would do in the future. They tested the communication between pairs of photons. They let one photon finish its journey and had to decide whether to be either a wave or a particle. Researchers stretched the distance the other photon took to reach its own detector. However, they could add a scrambler to prevent it from collapsing into a particle. Somehow, the first particle knew what the researcher was going to do before it happened, and it crossed distances instantaneously as if there were no space or time between them. They decide not to become particles before their twin even encounters the scrambler. It doesn't matter how we set up the experiment, our mind and its knowledge is the only thing that determines how they behave. Experiments consistently confirm these observer-dependent effects. Bizarre? Consider another experiment that was recently published in the prestigious scientific journal Science. In ellipses it says Jacques et al. 315,966,2007. Scientists in France shot photons into an apparatus and showed that what they did could retroactively change something that had already happened in the past. As the photons passed a fork in the apparatus, they had to decide whether to behave like particles or waves when they hit a beam splitter. Later on, well after the photons passed the fork, the experimenter could randomly switch a second beam splitter on and off. It turns out that what the observer decided at that point determined what the particle actually did at the fork in the past. At that moment, the experimenter chose his past. Of course, we live in the same world, but critics claim this behavior is limited to the microscopic world. But this two-world view, that is, one set of physical laws for small objects and another for the rest of the universe, including us, has no basis in reason and is being challenged in laboratories around the world. A couple years ago, researchers published a paper in Nature, Jost et al. 459,683,2009, showing that quantum behavior extends into the everyday realm. Pairs of vibrating ions were coaxed to entangle so their physical properties remained bound together when separated by large distances, otherwise known as spooky action at a distance, as Einstein put it. Other experiments with huge molecules called buckyballs also show that quantum reality extends beyond the microscopic world. In 2005, KHCO3 crystals exhibited entanglement ridges 1/2 inch high, quantum behavior nudging into the ordinary world of human-scale objects. We generally reject the multiple universes of Star Trek as fiction, but it turns out there is more than a morsel of scientific truth to this popular genre. One well-known aspect of quantum physics is that observations can't be predicted absolutely. Instead, there is a range of possible observations, each with a different probability. One mainstream explanation, the many worlds interpretation, states that each of these possible observations corresponds to a different universe, or the multiverse. There are an infinite number of universes, and everything that could possibly happen occurs in some universe at some point. Death does not exist in any real sense in these scenarios. All possible universes exist simultaneously, regardless of what happens in any of them. Life is an adventure that transcends our ordinary linear way of thinking. When we die, we do so not in the random billiard ball matrix, but in the inescapable life matrix. Life has a non-linear dimensionality. It's like a perennial flower that returns to bloom in the multiverse. The influences of the senses, said Ralph Waldo Emerson, has in most men overpowered the mind to the degree that the walls of space and time have come to look solid, real, and insurmountable. And to speak with levity of these limits in the world is the sign of insanity.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
Alright, this is from the website Cryptozoology News. The title is World War II Pilot Speaks Out, Gremlins Are Real. Posted on February 11th, 2014, and it's just listed as being written by Cryptozoology News. Okay. Jonesboro, Arkansas. A man who says he was a Boeing B-17 pilot during World War II contends that many of the plane failures which occurred during that time period were due to the mischievous actions of little creatures. LW, his initials are, 92, says these little beings were capable of attaching themselves to the fuselage and withstand high altitudes. Oh, they're real, all right. They climb inside the aircraft and hide in there, or hook up under the wings. I'm sure they were sabotaging most of the Allies' machinery. His father, an Episcopal preacher from Arkansas, has influenced LW's decision to become a pilot. My father loved planes.
When you're a preacher's kid, well, you either turn out a little angel or a complete demon. I kind of went in between and decided to fight for my country instead. I got wings, but I was no angel, he told Cryptozoology News. I was B-17 pilot. We were all young. I was 22 years old, and I was a flight commander. That was the average age for the officers. The gunners are usually 18-year-olds. We were very sharp, clean kids. One day, LW says he was flying a combat mission when the unexpected happened. Purportedly, a pair of Gremlins tried to crash the flying fortress. So I am very aware of my surroundings, and as I go higher, I notice an unusual sound coming from the engine. The instruments went nuts. I look at my right, and I see an entity staring at me. Then I look at the aircraft's nose, and there is another one, hanging in there, dancing lizards. The astonished pilot thought that maybe he was having an episode of spatial disorientation and hallucinations. But I was perfectly fine. My senses were in good shape, but the weird things were still there looking at me. They kept going at it, pounding the plane with all their might. LW says the creatures were 3 foot tall and had a hairless gray skin. The eyes were of a deep red color, and the mouths were so big he could almost count their teeth. The ears were long and pointy, with a small black patch of hair growing on the tips that reminded the witness of an owl's ear. They appeared to be laughing, with their big mouths open, looking at me, hitting the plane with their long arms trying to pull stuff. I have no doubt in my mind that they were trying to crash it. I managed to stabilize the flight, and I saw the critters falling off the aircraft. I don't know if they fell and died, or if they jumped from my plane to a different one. I have no idea. LW couldn't believe what he had seen, so when he went back to the base, he tried to keep the incident a secret. Well, I had to tell my best friend, a young kid named Leroy. He was a gunner. Oh, he believed me. He said he had seen something similar a few days earlier during a training exercise, but that he was afraid to tell an officer about it for fears of being sent back to the U.S. Well, we wanted to fight. We didn't want to be the ones coming back empty-handed, you know? At first, he says he believed what he saw was some sort of soldier developed by the Japanese. But then years later, in 1947, he came to a different conclusion. One day, I was reading about a strange aircraft crashing in Roswell, New Mexico. So I say, what the hell? That's the same people that got on my plane. Now they are trying to attack our country, too? I thought that if they were capable of building this type of advanced technology, oh boy, I thought we were done. Who knows what else they can do? Creatures of similar nature caused a controversy in Kentucky in 1955 in what has become known as the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter. 2 families in a farmhouse were reportedly terrorized by little goblin-like entities and strange weather phenomenon. It took LW over 70 years to come forward and tell his story to the public. Well, we were young and careless, fearless. We were, free birds, he said.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
On the next episode, I want to talk about some strange experiences I had growing up. Nothing is true, everything is permitted.
Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is